Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm John Noggle, Associate Professor of Warfighting Studies at the U.S. Army War College, and your host today. I'm interviewing Professor Nellie LaHood, a fellow War College faculty member who has written one of the most consequential books I've read in some time. Nellie's book, The Bin Laden Papers, is based on an extraordinary intelligence coup, the capture of tens of thousands of documents by the Navy SEAL team that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a decade ago. Those documents were declassified, and Nellie and her team sifted through some 97,000 files and identified al-Qaeda's internal communications, nearly 6,000 pages in Arabic. Nellie read them closely, finding out incredibly important information about the enemy who killed thousands of Americans 20 years ago in the worst terror attack in history. That attack, in turn, drove American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq that have been the dominant feature of the American national security landscape this century. Nellie's work chronicles al-Qaeda's history after September 11th, providing important insights into the effects of those wars. Nellie, welcome to War Room.
Thank you for the very kind words that you said, John. It means a lot to me, and thank you for hosting me.
I'm fascinated by your personal intellectual journey. Can you start with how you became fluent in Arabic?
I have the advantage of being a native Arabic speaker. I was born and grew up in Beirut, Lebanon, and English was the third language in the school that I attended. Having said that, and I'm sure Arabist listeners would understand exactly what I'm about to say, though I have the ability to read Arabic literature with ease, I always rely on dictionaries and lexicons when I'm reading texts to look up difficult words and appreciate the subtleties and meanings in the text. Arabic is not just a language, it's a lifetime commitment.
Obviously, you learned English along the way as well. Where did you go to university? Where did you do your graduate work? Those sorts of things. It's an interesting story.
I'm also Australian, in addition to being American and Lebanese. So I have 3 passports. I completed my tertiary education in Australia. My undergraduate studies were at Monash University in Melbourne, and my PhD was at the Australian National University in Canberra. And some years later, I've become American. I consider myself a New Yorker as well. So,
and when did you become interested in national security issues? How did that happen?
During my undergraduate years, I majored in politics and religion at Monash University. And for my PhD thesis, I explored how contemporary Arab thinkers appropriate and make use of the past, and specifically Islamic philosophy and Islamic theology, to advance their own political agenda. So my interest was bent towards political theory and religious studies, if you like. And this really, I didn't know at the time, I did not anticipate that all of this was going to prepare me so well to understand and study the jihadi groups.
Because you started this work before September 11th?
I did. And so my interest began to shift with world politics. As I said, I was really more interested in reading text and political theory and political philosophy. And then gradually in time, because of students' interest and because of my own interest, I began to shift my own focus of research. And it turned out really that all the preparation for my undergraduate work prepared me so well to be able to study these jihadi groups. And I say this because jihadi groups reject the world order of nation states, and they want to use religion as the alternative paradigm. And to that end, I was able to make use of all the studies that I thought were irrelevant for world politics, but this turned out really this prepared me well to understand and appreciate these issues that became the central focus of national security, especially after 9/11.
Mhm. And perhaps the most important of these jihadi groups, of course, is Al Qaeda. Can you tell me about Osama bin Laden's background? Where did he come from? His own study of and understanding of religion and of politics that led to what would ultimately be the book, the Bin Laden Papers.
To be clear, the book that I wrote does not delve into bin Laden's background. I learned from the studies, the books of Steve Cole and Peter Bergen
Both terrific.
about bin Laden's background, the wealth of his family, how people who knew him, what they had said about him, and so on. But just to build on some of the introductory notes that you mentioned at the outset, John, the book is based on bin Laden's personal papers, personal correspondence, all the personal papers that he composed after 9/11, starting 2002 until he was killed in May 2011. And these are documents that were not meant for public consumption. In addition to his own letters, we also have some of Al Qaeda's internal communiques. We have letters composed by bin Laden's family, including his wives and daughters. So we capture a window into bin Laden that had not existed before. We get to know him pretty well. Uh, since our conversation is about national security issues, let me focus on the motivations of bin Laden and what he sought to achieve through building his organization and the attacks that led to catastrophic consequences for the United States and for the world. We learn from his letters that his political objective was to reunite Muslims as a world community, the Ummah. He wants to he saw Muslims not as citizens of states, but as part of a global community, as the Ummah. This is the entity that united Muslims before the modern era of nation states. He saw himself as a champion of Muslim causes, and he was genuine about this. He cared a great deal about the plight of Palestinians, the Kashmiris, Muslims in Burma, and so on. And he was
And he
convinced.
fought, or at least was associated with, was hanging around as Muslims were fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan.
Absolutely, absolutely. He went from his birthplace, from Saudi Arabia, to Afghanistan to fight in causes that had nothing to do with his own nationality. He saw, as I said, he saw Muslims as a global community, transcending borders, ethnicity, race, and so on. So he was genuine about
Yeah, he put his money
championing.
where his mouth was. He lived a life of very wealthy family, lived a life of great privilege, and sort of gave it all up to sort of literally live in caves and fight in a war that wasn't about Saudi Arabia at all.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, and and
So
and
interesting, unusual, sort of almost a prophet or a true believer. There has to be an Islamic word, an Arabic word for this.
I don't know about an Arabic word, but I've heard that it is. I've read that something that a line that is attributed to Karl Marx, that terrorists are dangerous idealists, and Bin Laden fits that perfectly. He was a dangerous idealist. There's nothing in the letters about him that I found to have compromised his image in the eyes of his supporters. He did sacrifice his fortune for the cause that he believed in and that he championed. But to go back to your question, he, in order to remedy the plight of Muslims around the world, he wanted the jihadis, and he believed that the jihadis could bring down autocratic rulers that rule over Muslim majority states. And what stood between this objective and reality was U.S. support for these dictators. And he was convinced that if the U.S. were to withdraw its military presence from Muslim majority states, the jihadis would be able to fight these autocratic regimes on a level playing field, and in his mind that they would be able to bring them down.
So
And
if he could defeat the far enemy, the United States, then the near enemy would fall as well, and he could create the caliphate, the global sort of empire of Muslims.
He didn't put much thought into that. He spoke. The only thing about the caliphate that we hear is that he wanted to reunite the ummah. The caliphate was something in the distance. His main focus was about defeating and bringing down these regimes, and he wanted, the main objective of his attacks was to force the United States to withdraw its military forces from Muslim majority states. He started with the 1998 East Africa bombings, then with USS Cole, and then later it culminated in the 9/11 attacks. What he envisaged and what he hoped was that these would be attacks that would deliver, particularly the 9/11 attack, what he called a decisive blow that would get the Americans to take to the streets. He wanted the Americans to replicate the Vietnam anti-war protest so that Americans would call on their governments to withdraw from Muslim majority states. And this is where he would be able to achieve his own objective.
And he had clearly never visited the United States if he thought that hitting the Pentagon and the World Trade Center would cause that kind of reaction, because he got about 180 degrees out from that.
Well, he miscalculated badly. And this is really where two other aspects emerge out of understanding bin Laden's objectives. Two other sides of him emerge. Firstly, we get to know him as a planner, and there's something. He was an impressive planner. By that I mean he thought of all the small details that could go into an operation. Specifically, he was impressive in terms of using simple weaponry to achieve spectacular attacks and effects. The other side that emerges out of these letters is precisely what you said, which is a bin Laden who was at best sophomoric in terms of his understanding of the American public, of American politics, of international relations. And shockingly, he did not understand the limits of terrorism. And this is where he ended up being a failed terrorist leader. He failed at the things that he wanted to achieve. He emerges as as an impressive planner, as a dangerous idealist, but also as a failed terrorist leader.
Why do you think that was? What led the same person to be able to conduct the most successful terror attack in world history, cost the United States thousands of lives on September 11th, additional thousands of lives in the following wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, tens of thousands of people hurt, many of them my friends, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of expenses for the United States in these wars, in bills that will keep coming for decades to come. But the portrait that emerges in your book is of a sad man in sort of imprisoned in a house in a foreign country. What? How can And this is really what I want to get at in this podcast, because I think for many years the United States, Americans, people who fought in these wars, many of our listeners thought of Osama bin Laden as 10 feet tall. And while he was tall, he wasn't that tall, and he really wasn't that good after
No,
that one really good strike.
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a very diminutive bin Laden that emerges out of these letters. He was somebody who was confined to his compound, um, and I think some of these issues that you raised um, are also part of the miscalculations and the way that some of the counterterrorism community also um, misunderstood what was happening in the world of Al Qaeda and the world of global jihad. So I think for about a decade, he appeared to be somebody who was too powerful when in reality he was not. And we find that in the letters between himself and his associates. We find them struggling, whether it's finances, its inability to move. I think uh, there were many impediments after December 2001, after the collapse of the Taliban regime. The letters make it very clear that Al Qaeda was shattered by then, and Al Qaeda's ability to mount international terrorism came to a halt. This was he continued, though he continued to speak of the 9/11 attacks as victories from his perspective. By 2010, he admitted in his own letters to his associates that the attacks did not deliver what they hoped to achieve. And in 2010, when everybody was still, when the national security apparatus was still talking about this powerful bin Laden and this powerful Al Qaeda, he was writing to his associates, telling them that unless we do something, Al Qaeda as an organization is going to come to an end. The world that he ended up um, unleashing or creating as a result of the 9/11 attacks is not the world that he wanted. That's not how he wanted to change the world. Though the world really changed as a result of the 9/11 attacks, it changed in ways that he had not planned and that he did not desire. So again, the miscalculations that he made through these attacks did not achieve the objectives that he set out to achieve.
And I think it's safe to say, this was, I think, was the major implication of your book, for me at least, was that miscalculations from the other side, from the American side, our friends and allies who supported us in our efforts in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we believed that we were defending the world against an Al-Qaeda that continued to present an imminent threat. And what you argue in your book, what you learned from the papers, is something very different. And I'd like you, if you could, to go back to the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the death of Ahmed Shah Massoud at Al-Qaeda's hands. They had a really good September 10th and September 11th, but it was arguably catastrophic success. And then what happened to Al-Qaeda immediately afterwards?
Sure. So, what we learn from bin Laden's notes about the events that led to the decision of doing 9/11, uh, he faced some resistance from the Afghan Taliban, but he clearly had the support of Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar, throughout the letters, he comes across as somebody who is, to use bin Laden's language, he was a sincere leader who was steadfast. But we learn from the papers and from other works that were actually made available by other jihadi leaders who wrote about the concerns among some Afghan leaders about bin Laden's ongoing activities. My sense is just surmising and what happened, because I had to make some speculations judging by some of the notes that bin Laden was writing. I suspect that because the Afghan leaders were very much concerned about Ahmad Sheikh Masoud, and bin Laden kept on arguing with them, this is in his own personal notes, that you are concerned about this 5 kilometers when I'm concerned about the big picture. This is the world that I want to change, that the Muslims are facing hardship, and you're concerned about those 5 kilometers in the Panjshir Valley. Clearly, he came to realize that in order to win the support of the Afghan Taliban, he needed to get Ahmad Shah Massoud. And my thinking is that this was the quid pro quo, and I think he got the blessing of Mullah Omar to go ahead with the 9/11 after he got after they assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud. So what we learn from the letters is that Al Qaeda's leaders did not anticipate that the United States would go to war in response to 9/11. What they thought was that at most the United States would respond with some limited strikes, as they had done after the 1998 East Africa bombings, having some strikes against some of Al Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan. So when Operation Enduring Freedom was launched, this was a shock, and they found themselves in disarray. They didn't have a plan A. So the letters reveal that bin Laden had to disappear out of the scene out of necessity, and he did not communicate with his associates for nearly 3 years. He resumed contact with his associates in 2004. And we know this because the letters in 2004 are apprising him about what happened during the past 3 years and about his absence from the scene and so on and so forth. So we know that there was a period of 3 years that they were not in communications. Now,
Do we know where he was during those 3 years?
We don't know. I have some hunches, probably in Peshawar, but this is just a hunch. But we learn also that many of Al Qaeda's senior leaders were captured or killed. Initially, Al Qaeda's leaders and members of Al Qaeda fled to Pakistan, where they were met there by what the letters say as a comprehensive campaign that captured many of Al Qaeda's leaders. To quote them, 600 brothers were captured by the Pakistani authorities. Some of them ended up crossing illegally into Iran. There, they were supported by some Sunni militant groups who are opposed to the Iranian regime, and they were able to rent some houses under the radar using some of the IDs of these Sunni militants. They're referred to as the Baluch brothers in the letters. And we find out that for about 10 months, they were able to live freely or not freely, but in hiding in Iran. But at a certain point, the Iranian government was able to track them down and detain them. They were detained around December 2002. Among those who were detained was one of bin Laden's wives, their son, and 6 children by his first wife, Najwa. And most of Al Qaeda's senior leaders were detained in Iran. So those who remained at large were the second-tier Al Qaeda leaders, and these were the ones who were corresponding with bin Laden in 2004. The other senior leader was Ayman al-Zawahiri, who became bin Laden's successor after he was killed, and who was also killed last year. So, but also to appreciate what was happening to Al Qaeda, we're talking about fighters who had gone to Afghanistan not as agile fighters, but they had families and children, some of them up to 4 wives. with their children. So they had to leave Afghanistan, and they had nowhere else to go. So this was to use one of the letters. They report to Bin Laden about their afflictions, about the harrowing ordeals that they had to go through. These were 2004, and they continued to talk about the ongoing nightmare that they were facing. So Al Qaeda clearly uh, was shattered. Now, just to be clear, the other international terrorist attack that Al Qaeda carried out after 9/11 is the November 2002 Mombasa bombings. And the reason it was able to pull it off, because the operatives who had been dispatched to plan those attacks had been dispatched before 9/11, and they did not have to go through the ordeals that the others had to go through in Afghanistan. But beyond that, there is nothing in the letters that suggests that Al Qaeda was able to carry out any of the attacks that were attributed to Al Qaeda after 9/11.
And so you've covered really the some of the big revelations of the book to me that have caused me to think very hard about things that I thought were true and that it turns out might not have been. But the things that surprised me were how anti-Al Qaeda Iran was, and not just in words but in deeds. How effectively Pakistan worked to eradicate Al Qaeda from its territory, and as you say, that Al Qaeda essentially ceased to be a functioning terror organization after December 2001, with the exception of the Mombasa attack, which only happened because those folks had gotten out before September 11th. And so, what this leads me to is to ask is a very hard question for me to ask. Was Al Qaeda still a threat to America after the fall of the Taliban in 2001?
I mean, in terms of aspirations, yes. But in terms of capability, no. And I think one of the things that also emerges in the papers is the success of the CIA drone campaign. Because the letters continue to report about, to use their language, the martyrdom of brothers. And they refer to the drones as a calamity with which we've been afflicted. They refer to it as an evil. The drones were clearly very successful, and Al Qaeda was able, again, through the letters, I learned about this, to establish what we might want to call the drone spy nexus. They believed that the ISI, Pakistan's ISI, was helping the CIA a great deal in North Waziristan, where most of Al Qaeda's members were hiding. They speak about the area being infested with spies. They were concerned. I mean, those who were hiding in North Waziristan kept urging Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri to tone down their language, their public statements against Pakistan, because they wanted Pakistan to stop its support its support to the CIA with the drone campaign. So there were many successes in terms of what the US was doing. You can say it was relentless in terms of how they tried to ensure that not only they couldn't be operational, they couldn't even move in North Waziristan, and that comes out really clearly in the letters. It was made very clear, and when Bin Laden found out about what was happening, particularly the fact that even Al Qaeda lost the support of the Afghan Taliban, which is really the other shocking revelation for me from the letters. Bin Laden ordered his associates, particularly the top leaders, to hide just the same way as he was hiding in Pakistan. At one point, we find him calling on his associates, say, you need to evacuate the area. Clearly, the area is exposed. And this became very clear for him after Bob Woodward published the book, Obama's Wars. Some of its pages were translated for bin Laden. And he came to realize that North Waziristan is really not safe for his associates. So we find him writing to his associates saying, evacuate, do the same as I'm doing, come and hide in Pakistan along with some Pakistani brothers. Nobody's going to find out who is hiding in those places, just as his situation was. And we find his associates responding that the brothers would rather be martyred here rather than being captured by Pakistan's ISI. So clearly, Al-Qaeda's enmity of both Iran and Pakistan is made clear throughout the letters. There's absolutely no doubt about it.
And how about relations between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein's Iraq? Did we need to invade Iraq in March 2003 to protect ourselves against terrorism?
Well, the Secretary of State, the late Colin Powell, made a case at the United Nations in February 2003, just a couple of months or a month before the invasion, that Saddam Hussein was, he referred to Saddam Hussein's ties with Al-Qaeda. Clearly, there was none of that. This was...
there were no ties.
There were no ties, absolutely not. And the group, the jihadi group that emerged on the scene and that rose on the scene as a result of the Iraq War, the group that was led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, this group merged with Al-Qaeda in late 2004, not before the war. And to be clear, Zarqawi merged with Al-Qaeda because he wanted to acquire the Al-Qaeda brand, not because
he wanted the brand name.
That's right. He didn't.
There was no operational control.
No operational control. No resources.
Or even coordination, really.
Absolutely.
From your book, right?
Yeah. And they couldn't. Even when there were letters between Al Qaeda's leaders and various jihadi groups that emerged on the scene to fill the vacuum, because Al Qaeda was doing nothing afterwards, we find that Al Qaeda had little to no influence over these groups. Often we find Al Qaeda's leaders urging these groups to do less and not more terrorism. And this isn't to romanticize Al Qaeda here, but they wanted them to focus on the chief enemy, which was the United States. They wanted them to focus their attacks against the United States, just as Al Qaeda did.
Not against killing fellow Muslims.
Exactly. And we find bin Laden by 2010 referring to these jihadi groups as a liability to global jihad, writing that Muslims find them repulsive.
Bin Laden wanted Zarqawi to tone it down.
Oh, he wanted to tone it down, and in fact, we not just Zarqawi, but also other groups to tone it down. But also, I think that there needs what is important for us to understand. The reason why we have these papers is because bin Laden could not freely communicate with his associates. The only means of communications was through these letters that were typed electronically and that were saved on SIM cards and delivered through a complex chain of couriers to his associates in North Waziristan. He didn't have access, or he didn't want to use the telephone or the internet. And that's the reason why he was able to stay under the radar for so long.
And not be visited by a drone strike.
Absolutely, to evade capture.
Not be found by ISI.
Exactly. So with that in mind, even in the best of scenarios, in the best of cases, it was a challenge to be able to command or control these jihadi groups that were acting in Al-Qaeda's name. But what's more, we find in many of the letters of these jihadi groups is that they didn't want to comply with Al-Qaeda's advice. And we find bin Laden and his associates frustrated, particularly with a group in Yemen that supposedly was Al-Qaeda's protege. And we find bin Laden so frustrated with the leader of that group in Yemen and educating them about the basics of Al-Qaeda and what they should be doing and so on.
Reading these letters, it felt, I have a teenager in my house, and it felt exactly like that kind of relationship. Like, I spawned you and you were being a bad child, sort of. I don't want to, I'm projecting now, but there was almost a paternal sense of frustration from bin Laden in my reading of the letters.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And so we've learned from the bin Laden papers, from the good work of the Navy SEAL team, the CIA analysts, and your team, and your personal translations, we've learned that Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with Iraq, no support from Iran or from Pakistan, even lost the support of the Afghan Taliban after September 11th, was isolated, unable to communicate, able to communicate only with great difficulty, had little operational reach. You are suggesting, I think it's safe to say, that Al-Qaeda did not present much of a threat to the United States after September 11th, and certainly there was no reason to invade Iraq in order to get at Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda's affiliates, copycats, came into Iraq only in the wake of the American invasion. Saddam would never have let them in. Is that all accurate?
I know that he's accurate. In fact, when bin Laden's second-tier leaders were reporting to him in 2004 after they resumed contact, and they were discussing in their letters about their afflictions, they only had one good story to tell him. He said, when God heard of our afflictions, he opened the door of jihad for us in Iraq. We should pack up and leave. So Iraq was a lifeline for Al-Qaeda. The reason, not that they were able to engage in Iraq, but it gave the brand a lifeline, even though they themselves were not present in Iraq. But it gave the brand a lifeline that continued to be able to incite others to join the jihad, as if Al-Qaeda was being operational when it wasn't.
And our friend Peter Bergen has made that argument before, of course, that September 11th was catastrophic success for Al-Qaeda, but that they got really a huge rejuvenation from the American invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. Our friend Peter has also said that Al-Qaeda's best day since September 11th was August 15th, 2021, when the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan, almost exactly 20 years after the United States, the Northern Alliance, had recaptured it. Can you talk to a little bit, and I know this is of course not in the bin Laden papers, it may be in the next edition, but can you talk to your assessment of the strength of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and in Afghanistan now? Did the retaking of Afghanistan by the Taliban give new hope to Al-Qaeda and the threat to the United States from that part of the world now?
I make it clear in the acknowledgments to the book how important Peter Bergen was for me and for his mentorship. I think my book wouldn't have been written had it not been for the support of Peter Bergen. But I do disagree on that front with Peter about the fact that Al-Qaeda's best day was the return of the Taliban. I say this because the letters make it really clear that for a very long time, bin Laden, his successor Ayman al-Zawahiri, and other Al-Qaeda leaders had been fearing these same Taliban leaders who came back to power, they named them by name in the letters as being the insincere Taliban movement, the hypocrites who were ready to sell Al-Qaeda and render Al-Qaeda impotent in order to return to Kabul, and they were ready to make a deal with the Americans. They started writing about this as early as 2007. So the 2021, from my perspective, is not a mistake in terms of withdrawal. My question about what happened in terms of the U.S. policies towards Afghanistan, why did it take so long to leave Afghanistan? Why did the United States end up signing an agreement with the same group that they excluded back in 2002? And why did they exclude the Afghan Taliban from the negotiations to bring peace to Afghanistan? So some of these miscalculations have led to major consequences, and not just wasting resources, but human lives on all fronts, both Americans and Afghan lives. So I don't see Al-Qaeda gaining anything by the return of those specific Afghan Taliban to power, because bin Laden made it clear that he wanted to weaken these insincere Taliban and strengthen the sincere Taliban. So clearly, if those insincere Taliban are back in power, that is a defeat for Al-Qaeda, not for the United States. Now, the question is, again, moving forward, there needs to be some cold calculations about whether a failed Taliban would serve the United States better or not. I don't think that the failure of the Taliban is in the U.S. interest at the moment, particularly when ISIS-K and other groups would like to really see the Taliban failing and for them to fill the vacuum. So I think the alternative to the Taliban is worse than the Taliban, and I am being cold in my calculations. And I think the policies towards Afghanistan need to weigh these considerations in mind.
And certainly the unclassified reports we've seen in the press from congressional briefings, from my West Point classmate, Eric Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Intelligence analysis that has been publicly released, is that we are again seeing a threat, or a new threat, in Afghanistan as some of that territory becomes less governed, as America doesn't have as many intelligence sources on the ground there, as we no longer have Bagram Air Base from which to operate. And so my fear remains that the end of this story has not yet been written. Although, of course, the end of bin Laden's story was written by those SEALs who gave you the material for this absolutely terrific book. Your closing words, Nellie?
Thank you again for hosting me, and I hope that that some of those, the fact that Al-Qaeda was shattered is a small consolation to those who were victims of Al-Qaeda. I know it's not the same thing, but it is a consolation to know that the man responsible for the 9/11 attacks was powerless and confined to his compound by the end of his days,
and ultimately was brought to justice by the armed forces of the United States of America far later than he should have been, but nonetheless, I think it was essential that the world know that you cannot destroy American lives in that way, attack the United States homeland, and hope to survive. And so that was it was good to read in your book, in the Bin Laden papers, the devastation that was wreaked upon al-Qaeda in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, if deeply discouraging to learn that much of the work we did in both in Iraq and I'm not as convinced, but perhaps in Afghanistan as well, was unnecessary, and certainly could have been done more wisely if we'd had a better understanding of the principles at play, of the dynamics inside al-Qaeda, between al-Qaeda and the various Taliban organizations. So I think you've done really important as well as groundbreaking work on the inner workings of what we thought was our principal adversary of the past 20 years. And I just really want to encourage everyone who's listening to read the Bin Laden papers. I think it'll help American soldiers and scholars better understand the wars we've been fighting, and will also help us better prepare for future threats to the West. I really feel as if Nellie has done an enormous service to her third country, but the one that has the privilege of having her company now. So thanks to Nellie for a terrific conversation, one of many I've had with her over the course of the last year. Thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments and suggestions for this and future episodes, and please subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice. Once you have, please rate and review this podcast, because that's how more people can hear about us, so we can continue to grow this community for conversations just like this one. This conversation is over, but we look forward to welcoming you again. Until next time from the War Room, I'm John Noggle.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.